Maple Ridge wasn't much to look at, not if you were passing through on your way to somewhere bigger. The town lay tucked between rolling hills, where the trees grew thick and the clouds drifted so low they looked like they could sweep the roofs right off the houses. A single road, lined with a few storefronts and little shops, served as its heartbeat, its pulse. Main Street was where you'd find the hardware store, the post office, a couple of antique shops, and most importantly, Carson's Diner. Carson's Diner was something of an institution. Even folks who had long since moved on from Maple Ridge could tell you about the smell of fresh coffee that greeted you the minute you stepped inside. The squeaky front door that never quite shut right, and the bell above it that rang just a little off-key. To the regulars, it was home, and that was thanks to Martha Carson. Martha had been working in that diner since she was barely out of her teens. Back then, it had belonged to someone else, but life had a way of twisting and turning. And eventually, the place landed in her hands. Now in her 60s, Martha moved around her little diner with the grace and ease of someone who knew every inch of the place by heart. She kept the tables spotless, the coffee brewing strong, and the pie case filled with slices of homemade goodness that folks swore were the best for miles. Martha's look was understated. Her curly grey hair was usually pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore aprons that had faded over the years, almost like the colors had just blended in with her routine. Her laugh was quiet but warm, like the feeling of slipping on an old sweater. Her eyes, though, they held a kind of distance, like they were seeing something far off, just past the view of Maple Ridge's green hills. There was a softness in her voice, but there were years of stories hidden behind her words, stories she hadn't shared, maybe not even with herself. Every morning, Martha would open up Carson's Diner at the crack of dawn. The regulars, a handful of farmers, retirees, and the odd traveler, would filter in, greeting her by name as if it was as natural as breathing. They liked Martha because she was steady, always there with a refill and a kind word, even on the days when the weather was mean or their luck had taken a sour turn. "Hey, Martha," old Tom would say, leaning over the counter to peer at her. "How's the coffee today? Strong enough to make me forget my age?" And she'd laugh, her voice like a familiar tune. "Tom, it'd take a miracle to make you forget that," she'd tease back, sliding him a cup that was just shy of boiling. And that was how she was, never too loud, never too soft. Martha was there, a constant, like the mountains that stood just outside the edge of town. The cafe itself was a reflection of Martha. Simple, comforting, a little worn around the edges. The booths were upholstered in faded vinyl, cracked in places where time had worn them thin. But they were still as comfortable as they'd been the day they were installed. The walls were lined with old black and white photos of Maple Ridge's early days, pictures that Martha had held onto, though she couldn't quite remember who all the folks in them were. Every now and then, a younger face would wander in. Someone from out of town who'd heard about the diner through the grapevine. They'd order a slice of pie or maybe a burger, and they'd sit and look around, maybe noticing how each of the locals gave Martha a nod or a smile, like she was part of the foundation of the place. And in a way, she was. Martha had outlasted many of the people who had walked through that door. But for all the comfort, all the warmth that radiated from Carson's Diner, Martha carried something else inside her, something that lingered, casting a faint shadow on her gentle demeanor. It was as if there was a part of her she had packed away, carefully hidden where no one could reach it. No one would ever guess it from the way she smiled or from how quick she was to lend a listening ear, but there was a past she kept to herself. Sometimes when the diner was empty and the only sound was the ticking of the old clock by the register, Martha would stand at the counter, her eyes drifting off as if she could see something in the distance. Her mind would wander, her hand absently wiping down the counter for the 100th time, lost in thoughts she'd never speak aloud. Maple Ridge might have been small, but it had a way of holding on to people, of drawing them back in. The people here had stories, just like the trees on the hills had rings inside, each one telling of another year, another chapter. Martha was no different. The people around her had always known there was something she wasn't saying, but they respected her silence. Everyone knew Martha had her reasons. Still, she had moments when a memory would slip through, like when she caught a young couple sharing a quiet moment in the booth by the window, or when the smell of a certain kind of cologne wafted through the door. Those memories, they were like whispers, brushing up against her heart in a way that reminded her of things she'd kept hidden for years. In the evenings, when the sun was setting and the diner had quieted down, Martha would sit on the front steps with a cup of coffee, watching the day end. She'd let herself drift for a bit, her thoughts taking her back to times and places no one else knew about. The hills turned gold in the fading light. And she felt the familiar ache, a reminder of choices she'd made, paths she'd taken and left behind. People came to Carson's Diner for the comfort of it, the predictability. But for Martha, it was more than that. It was a place where she could stay close to her memories, where she could exist in the present without completely letting go of her past. And as the days went by, she continued to hold that balance, quietly, resolutely, with no one the wiser. And that was just fine with Martha. If Maple Ridge was a picture of quiet routine, then Chicago was its complete opposite. A city pulsing with energy, where ambition filled the air like the endless honking of car horns echoing through the skyscrapers. Daniel Carson had come a long way from his humble beginnings in that small town. Here in the heart of Chicago, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was someone people noticed. Daniel's world was sleek and sharp, much like the glass and steel towers that surrounded his office. He was 38. The CEO of a financial firm that seemed to thrive on high-stakes risks and bold moves. His office was on the top floor, offering a sweeping view of Lake Michigan, which on some days looked as polished and cold as the decisions he often made. It was the kind of view that made him feel on top of the world of. And yet, in a way he couldn't explain, he felt like he was always looking down at something he couldn't quite reach. Every morning, Daniel's routine was meticulously crafted to fit his image. His suits were always tailored, his shoes shined to a mirror-like finish. He wore a watch that cost more than he'd like to admit, a subtle reminder of the power he wielded. He had a calendar filled with meetings, appointments, and deals that ran like clockwork, and a team that respected him, if not out of genuine admiration, then out of the awareness that he didn't accept mediocrity. Yet, even as he walked through his office halls, exchanging brisk greetings and quick nods, there was a disconnect, something hollow in his gaze that even he couldn't fully ignore. He had what most would call the American dream: success, wealth, and power. But there was an edge to him that hinted at something else, a restlessness, a discontent that lingered beneath the surface, especially when he caught himself lost in thought. In truth, Daniel didn't often allow himself to think about his past. It wasn't that he was ashamed of Maple Ridge or his upbringing, but he'd spent years perfecting the art of leaving things behind. His life was defined by forward momentum, by the deals he closed and the progress he made. And yet, every now and then, there was something that tugged at him, something he couldn't quite shake. It was a feeling that crept in during the rare quiet moments when he was alone in his apartment, the city lights casting shadows on the walls. At night, Daniel's apartment was as pristine as his office, a space filled with clean lines, designer furniture, and artwork that felt more like investments than personal expressions. It was beautiful, yet impersonal. a perfect reflection of the life he'd built. Friends were scarce, and relationships even scarcer. There were people he went out with, colleagues he occasionally dined with at expensive restaurants. But his personal life had been whittled down to a series of transactions, each as calculated as the last. On some level, Daniel knew this. He recognized the coldness in his own life, the way his days felt like a performance he couldn't quite leave. But he was good at ignoring it, good at pushing it down and focusing on his work. Where he was in control, where every move made sense. But lately something was shifting. It was subtle, like a whisper he couldn't fully catch, a memory that brushed up against him and disappeared before he could grasp it. It was there in the way his thoughts drifted when he was supposed to be focusing. In the quiet moments when he'd stare out over the lake, feeling something he couldn't name. He hadn't spoken to his mother in a long time. They exchanged cards on the holidays, maybe the occasional phone call when something important came up, but their relationship was defined more by distance than connection. Daniel knew she was still in Maple Ridge, running that little diner of hers, and a part of him admired her for it. But another part, the part that had propelled him to leave in the first place, saw her life as something he'd escaped from, something he'd needed to leave behind to become who he was now. And yet, even as he told himself this, there was a lingering guilt he couldn't shake. A part of him knew he'd left more than just a town behind. He'd left a piece of himself, a piece that maybe he needed to find again. He felt it in the silence of his apartment, in the way his successes felt fleeting. Like they were always slipping through his fingers. This inattention became especially clear on the night he received a letter from his mother. It was a plain envelope, almost out of place among the polished professional documents that usually filled his desk. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, looping and a little faded, like something that belonged to a different time. For a moment he just stared at it, caught off guard by the suddenness of it, the reminder of a life he hadn't allowed himself to think about. He almost left it there, thinking he'd deal with it later, but something compelled him to open it. His fingers moving almost of their own accord. Inside, the letter was brief, almost cryptic. His mother's words were careful, yet there was an urgency he could feel between the lines. "Daniel, I think it's time we talked. There's something you need to know." That was all she'd written, but it was enough to unsettle him. Enough to leave him staring at the paper long after he'd read it. He couldn't imagine what she could mean. His mother was a private woman, quiet and unassuming, and as far as he knew, she didn't keep secrets. But here she was, asking him to come back, to revisit a part of his life he thought he'd left behind. He spent that night in a kind of restless haze, pacing his apartment, his thoughts circling back to the letter over and over. There was a part of him that wanted to ignore it, to pretend it didn't matter. But another part, deeper and more insistent, told him that this was something he couldn't just walk away from. And so, for the first time in years, Daniel found himself looking at flights, planning a trip not for business, but for something far more personal. He didn't know what he'd find back in Maple Ridge, didn't know if he was ready to face whatever his mother had to say, but he couldn't ignore the pull, the sense that maybe, just maybe, there was something there he needed to understand. The days after receiving his mother's letter passed in a blur for Daniel. He'd booked a flight and made all the necessary arrangements to leave Chicago for a few days, but his mind couldn't fully settle. In the back of his head, a quiet unease lingered, like the weight of something he'd carried without realizing it, as he moved through his routine, meetings, phone calls, working dinners. Daniel found himself increasingly distracted, almost as if something inside him was already halfway to Maple Ridge. He tried to shake it off, to tell himself that this trip was nothing more than a detour, something he'd deal with quickly so he could return to the life he'd built. But his thoughts kept circling back, and in the stillness of his apartment at night, he felt the pull of something he couldn't quite name. Across the country, in her small corner of Maple Ridge, Martha felt a similar restlessness. Ever since she'd mailed the letter, a quiet sense of anticipation had hung over her, filling the quiet moments with a kind of nervous energy. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that Daniel deserved to know the truth. But doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. What if he didn't understand? What if this secret she'd kept for so long only pushed him further away? For years, Martha had lived with the weight of her choices, carefully wrapping each memory in silence and storing it somewhere deep inside. It had been a lonely kind of burden, but one she'd accepted as necessary. She'd always told herself that it was for the best, that she was protecting Daniel, even if it meant keeping a part of herself hidden. But as she went through her days, greeting customers with her usual warmth, serving coffee and chatting with the regulars, Martha felt a subtle shift, a crack in the carefully constructed shell she'd built around herself. She'd lived alone with her memories for so long, she wasn't sure how to share them anymore, and yet here she was, waiting for her son to return, hoping he would be willing to listen. In her quiet moments, Martha found herself thinking back to the early days, to the years when Daniel was still young. Those were the days she held closest, memories that brought a mix of joy and sorrow she could hardly put into words. She remembered his laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he discovered something new, his curiosity and eagerness to understand the world around him. She'd loved him fiercely, in a way that only a mother could. And those memories were her most precious treasures. But there were also memories she kept at a distance, moments she tried not to revisit. The decision she'd made, the path that had led them to this distance, it was something she rarely let herself dwell on. But now, with Daniel coming back, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She'd have to face those choices head-on, to explain herself in a way that he could understand. Meanwhile, Daniel's thoughts drifted to his mother in ways he hadn't allowed for years. He remembered bits and pieces of his childhood, flashes of a simpler life that felt like they belonged to someone else. He saw her in his mind, her hands busy at the stove, the way she'd hum as she worked, her presence steady and comforting. And even though he'd told himself he'd outgrown that life, there was a part of him that felt the loss of it, a quiet ache that he couldn't quite name. In a way, Daniel realized, he'd always been running. His drive, his ambition, the relentless pace he kept, it was as if he was constantly trying to outrun something he didn't want to face. Success had been his way of proving himself, of creating a life that was as far removed from his past as possible. But now, with the letter in his pocket and the flight to Maple Ridge looming, he felt as if all the distance he'd built was starting to collapse. As he sat in his office one evening, long after everyone else had gone home, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He loosened his tie, leaning back in his chair as he looked out over the city. The lights stretched out before him, a glittering reminder of everything he'd achieved, but they felt hollow somehow, like they were mocking the emptiness he carried. He thought about calling his mother, of maybe reaching out before he arrived. But each time he picked up the phone, the words wouldn't come. What could he say after all these years? How could he bridge the silence that had grown between them? He wasn't sure if he knew how to talk to her anymore, wasn't sure if he could let down the walls he'd built so carefully. And so, Daniel waited, each day bringing him closer to a past he'd tried to leave behind. Back in Maple Ridge, Martha felt the weight of that same silence. The distance that had grown between them like an unspoken truth, neither of them could escape. She moved through her routines, trying to keep herself busy, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the letter, to the words she hadn't written, the things she hadn't yet said. Sometimes late at night when the diner was quiet, Martha would sit at one of the booths, the lights dimmed around her, and let herself remember. She thought about the choices she'd made, the sacrifices she'd accepted, and the parts of herself she'd buried for the sake of her son. It was a kind of love that hurt, a love that held secrets and silence, a love that she wasn't sure he would ever understand. And as she waited for him to return, Martha felt both fear and hope. She feared what his reaction might be, feared that he wouldn't understand. But she also hoped that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a chance to heal the wounds that had festered in silence for so long. As the days passed, both Martha and Daniel found themselves in a strange state of transition, each experiencing subtle shifts in the way they viewed their lives. It was as if the weight of their shared history, the silence they'd both kept, was finally starting to lift, little by little, bringing moments of unexpected clarity. For Martha, the changes began in her quiet moments, in the early mornings when she'd open the diner and stand alone for a few minutes, watching the sun creep over the hills that surrounded Maple Ridge. There was a stillness in those moments, a kind of peace that she'd learned to appreciate over the years. And yet, with Daniel's impending arrival, that peace felt different, charged with something she couldn't quite name. She started to think more about her past choices, allowing herself to look back on them with a new kind of honesty. For years, she told herself she'd done what was necessary, that the decisions she'd made had been for the best. But now, as she prepared to face her son and the secrets she'd kept from him, Martha began to see her actions through a different lens. There were memories she'd long kept locked away, choices she'd made out of love, but also out of fear. She thought about the times she'd wanted to reach out to Daniel, to share parts of herself with him that she'd kept hidden but had held back, believing it would be easier that way. Now, with the prospect of finally revealing the truth, she felt both liberated and vulnerable. As she worked in the diner, serving her customers with the same warmth she always had, Martha found herself opening up in small ways, sharing bits of her own life with the people around her. She laughed a little more freely, let herself linger in conversations, and felt a renewed sense of connection with the people who came through her doors each day. For the first time in years, she was beginning to feel that maybe she didn't have to carry everything on her own. On the other side of the country, Daniel was experiencing his own subtle transformations. Since receiving his mother's letter, he'd found it harder to throw himself into his usual routines with the same intensity. Meetings that once felt vital now seemed mundane, and the pressure he'd always thrived on felt less fulfilling. It was as if a part of him was waking up, a part that he'd buried under years of ambition and drive. In the quiet moments between meetings, or late at night when he was alone in his apartment, Daniel allowed himself to think about the life he'd left behind. He remembered the little things, the smell of his mother's cooking, the warmth of her hand on his shoulder, the way she'd hum while she worked. These memories, once so easy to ignore, now felt more vivid, more real, pulling him back to a place he'd thought he'd outgrown. Daniel started to question the choices he'd made, wondering if the success he'd achieved had come at a cost he hadn't fully understood. He thought about the people he'd kept at arm's length, the friendships he'd allowed to fade, the relationships he'd let slip away. There was a part of him that craved connection, a part that longed for something more meaningful than the endless cycle of deals and deadlines. As the days passed, Daniel began to make small changes in his life. He reached out to an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, and they met for coffee, talking about things that went beyond work and success. He found himself listening more, asking questions, letting down his guard in ways he hadn't allowed himself to in a long time. It was a small step, but it felt significant, a reminder that there was more to life than the persona he'd built. In these small acts, both Martha and Daniel were beginning to let go of the walls they'd built around themselves. They were each discovering, in their own way, that the silence they'd kept had been a kind of prison, one that they were finally ready to break free from. The closer Daniel's trip to Maple Ridge came, the more they felt this change, an almost imperceptible shift that hinted at the possibility of healing. Martha found herself feeling lighter, more open to the people around her, even if they didn't know the full story of what she was going through. She started to find joy in the little things, the laughter of her customers, the way the morning light filled the diner, the quiet moments when she could simply be. She realized that, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what was coming. She was ready to face it, to finally let her son see her as she was, with all her flaws and secrets. For Daniel, the changes were more subtle but just as profound. He was learning to reconnect with a part of himself he'd forgotten, a part that valued connection over accomplishment, meaning over success. He started to see his life through a different lens, questioning the values he'd built his world around. He realized that he didn't want to be defined by his career alone, that there was more to him than the role he played in the corporate world. As the day of their reunion approached, both mother and son felt a quiet anticipation, a sense that something important was about to happen. They didn't know exactly what would come of their meeting, but they were each ready in their own way to face whatever truths might come to light. And so, in those days leading up to the reunion, both Martha and Daniel took small but meaningful steps toward healing, opening themselves to the possibility of forgiveness, connection, and perhaps even a new beginning. Each was on a path of growth, rediscovering parts of themselves they'd long kept hidden, preparing, in ways they didn't fully understand, for the moment when their lives would cross again. The day Daniel arrived in Maple Ridge, the sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low over the rolling hills like a grey blanket. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He drove down Main Street, the familiar sights blending together in a rush of memories he'd tried to bury. The little hardware store, the old post office, the rows of shops with faded signs, they were all there, unchanged, just like he'd left them. Geez, as he pulled up in front of Carson's diner, he felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. It had been years since he'd last stepped through those doors, and even though he'd told himself he was ready, he wasn't sure what to expect. He sat in the car for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the sign that bore his family's name. A lifetime of memories filled the space between him and that door, memories he'd kept locked away until now. Inside the diner, Martha had been preparing for his arrival all morning. She'd kept herself busy, making sure everything was just right, even though she knew it didn't matter. She'd cleaned the tables, arranged the pie case, and brewed fresh coffee, though she hadn't had the heart to pour herself a cup. The anticipation hung in the air, making her hands tremble as she moved around the empty diner, waiting. When the bell above the door finally rang, Martha turned, her heart catching in her throat. There he was, her son, standing in the doorway, looking both familiar and like a stranger. He was taller, broader, his face sharper, marked by years of life she hadn't been a part of. But his eyes, those were the same, and for a moment she felt like she was looking at the boy she'd once known. Daniel paused, taking in the sight of his mother, the place that had once been his home. He felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief, apprehension, a longing he couldn't quite name. He took a step forward, his gaze meeting hers, and in that silent exchange, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Daniel," she replied, her voice breaking just a little. She wanted to reach out, to hug him, but she held back, unsure if he'd welcome the gesture. Instead, she smiled, a small, tentative smile that carried all the love she'd kept inside. They sat down at a booth, the familiar creak of the vinyl filling the silence between them. Martha poured him a cup of coffee, the way she'd done 1,000 times for her customers, but this time it felt different. Like a ritual, a small act of connection. Daniel took the cup, nodding his thanks, and for a moment they sat in silence, both of them searching for the right words. "It's been a long time," he said finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "It has," she replied, her gaze soft but steady. She wanted to tell him so many things, to explain everything she'd kept hidden, but the words felt tangled, caught somewhere deep inside. Instead, she let the silence settle, hoping he would understand. They talked for a while, the conversation stilted at first, each of them skirting around the real reason they were there. They spoke of small things, how the town had changed, the people who'd come and gone, the diner, the weather. But beneath the surface, there was a tension, an unspoken understanding that this was only the beginning, that there was more they needed to say. After a while, Daniel looked down at his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he began, his voice low. "Why now? Why did you want me to come back?" Martha took a breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she dreaded, the moment she knew had to come. "There's something I need to tell you, Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." He looked at her, his gaze piercing, and she saw the questions in his eyes, the hurt, the confusion. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it over his. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry for everything I kept from you." Daniel didn't pull his hand away, but he didn't speak either. He simply waited, his expression guarded, as if he was bracing himself for whatever was coming. Martha took another deep breath, gathering her courage. "I've kept things from you. Things about our family, about your father, about why I made the choices I did. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was wrong. You deserve the truth." His gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "Mom, I just want to know. Whatever it is, I can handle it. I just want to understand." Her heart ached at his words, at the weight he carried that she'd tried to spare him. She began to speak, her words halting at first, but as she went on, the story unfolded layer by layer. She told him about his father, about the life they'd once had, the sacrifices she'd made to keep him safe, to give him a chance at a better life. Daniel listened in silence, his face unreadable as he absorbed each word. Each piece of a story he'd never known. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, a sense of betrayal, but also a growing empathy for the woman sitting across from him, the mother who had done what she thought was best, even if it meant losing a part of herself. When she finished, Martha looked at him. Martha looked, her eyes filled with tears she'd long held back. "I know I can't change the past, Daniel, but I hope you can forgive me, or at least understand why I did what I did." He was silent for a moment, the weight of everything she'd said settling over him. He felt as if a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing had finally clicked into place, filling a void he'd carried for as long as he could remember. Slowly, he reached across the table, his hand covering hers, a gesture of understanding, of forgiveness, of love. "I'm here now, Mom," he said softly. "We can start from here." In that moment, the distance that had once separated them seemed to disappear, replaced by a bond that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. They sat together in the quiet of the diner, mother and son, connected by a love that had weathered years of silence and secrets, stronger than ever. After that intense conversation in the diner, something shifted between Martha and Daniel. It was subtle at first, like the change in the air after a long-awaited storm. They both felt lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted. For the first time in years, Martha felt she could look at her son and see him fully, not the successful businessman he'd become, but the boy she'd once held close. The one she'd sacrificed so much to protect. Over the next few days, they began to fall into a rhythm, one that was both familiar and new. Daniel stayed in town, renting a small cabin on the edge of Maple Ridge. It wasn't as luxurious as his apartment in Chicago, but he found a kind of peace there that he hadn't known he was missing. Each morning, he'd walk to the diner where Martha would have a pot of coffee ready, and they'd share breakfast, their conversations growing deeper and more natural with each passing day. They spoke of the small things and the big things, weaving together a tapestry of memories and experiences that had once separated them. Martha told him stories from her youth, of the dreams she'd once had, the life she'd imagined before everything had changed. She shared pieces of herself that she'd kept hidden, allowing Daniel to see her not just as his mother, but as a person, a woman with hopes, regrets, and a strength she hadn't always realized she possessed. Daniel, too, began to open up, sharing parts of his life in Chicago that he'd never thought he'd talk about with her. He spoke of the pressures of his job, the loneliness that crept in despite his success, and the feeling that no matter how much he achieved, something was always missing. In sharing these truths, he felt a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in years, and he found comfort in his mother's quiet understanding. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of the diner, Martha looked out over the town, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, her voice soft, "I always worried that I'd failed you, that by keeping the truth from you, I'd lost you." Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady. "Mom, you didn't lose me. I may have been distant, but I think part of me always knew you were doing what you thought was right. It just took me a while to understand." She smiled, a gentle, almost wistful expression that softened the lines on her face. "Thank you, Daniel. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself completely, but hearing that, it helps." For the first time, they allowed themselves to embrace fully, holding on to each other in a way that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of a love that had survived everything life had thrown at them. In that moment, they weren't just mother and son. They were two people who had walked separate paths but had found their way back to each other. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself questioning the life he'd built in Chicago. For so long, he'd chased success, believing that it was the key to fulfillment. But now, in the quiet of Maple Ridge, he was beginning to see things differently. He realized that the emptiness he'd felt wasn't something that success could fill. It was something deeper, something that could only be healed by reconnecting with the people and the parts of himself he'd left behind. Martha watched this transformation in her son with a quiet pride. She saw him letting go of the barriers he'd built, embracing a softer, more authentic side of himself. She encouraged him to explore this newfound self, gently nudging him to consider what truly mattered to him. One evening, as they were closing up the diner together, Daniel looked around, taking in the worn booths, the faded photos on the walls, and the faint smell of coffee that seemed to permeate everything. "You know," he said, a hint of nostalgia in his voice, "I used to think I had to leave all this behind to be someone." Martha rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm and steady. "You are someone, Daniel, but you don't have to be defined by where you are or what you do. Sometimes the people we become are a reflection of where we started, even if we don't realize it." He looked at her, a new respect in his eyes, and nodded. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. As they stood together in the dim light of the diner, an idea began to take shape in Daniel's mind. He didn't have to go back to the life he'd known, the life that had left him feeling hollow. Maybe he could create something new, something that allowed him to stay connected to his roots while still moving forward. Over the next few days, Daniel began to talk to his mother about his plans, sharing with her his vision for a life that balanced both the ambition he'd always carried and the connection he now craved. They spoke of ideas, dreams, and possibilities, allowing themselves to imagine a future that was shaped not by past mistakes, but by the strength of their bond. For Martha, this was a gift she hadn't dared to hope for, a chance to see her son truly happy, truly whole. She knew that whatever he chose, whether he stayed or left, he would be carrying a piece of this place, a piece of her, with him. And that was enough. On his last night in Maple Ridge, Daniel and Martha sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, a quiet beauty that seemed to capture the essence of everything they'd been through. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the understanding they'd both fought so hard to reach. As the stars began to appear, Daniel took his mother's hand, holding it gently. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice filled with gratitude, "for everything." Martha squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Thank you, Daniel, for coming back." And as they sat together under the vast expanse of the sky, mother and son, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, their bond stronger than ever, shaped by love, forgiveness, and the resilience of a shared past. With his visit to Maple Ridge coming to an end, Daniel found himself lingering at the diner one last time, taking in the details of the place that had once been his entire world. The creak of the floorboards, the faint smell of brewed coffee, the way the light filtered through the windows in the early morning, all of it felt like a part of him, a part he hadn't realized he'd missed. Martha stood behind the counter watching her son with a soft smile. She could see the change in him, the quiet transformation that had taken place over these past few weeks. He seemed lighter, more at ease, as if he'd finally found something he'd been searching for all along. "Are you sure you're ready to go back?" she asked gently, knowing that this trip had been as much a journey inward for him as it had been a physical one. Daniel looked at her, his gaze steady. "I am," he replied, "but I think things will be different now. I feel like I've found something here that I didn't even know I was missing." She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. There was a peace in knowing they'd finally shared the truths that had once separated them, a comfort in the bond they'd rebuilt. "Just remember, Daniel," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "home is always here if you need it." Those words lingered with him as he made his way back to Chicago. This time, as he returned to his life, it was with a sense of purpose that went beyond his career. He carried with him the lessons of Maple Ridge, the quiet wisdom of his mother's love, and the strength that came from facing the truths they'd both hidden for so long. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel found himself making changes. He simplified his life, letting go of the things that no longer mattered. He reconnected with people he'd once pushed away, rediscovering the value of relationships and the importance of sharing his life with others. The hollowness he'd felt for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet contentment that came from knowing who he was and where he came from. Back in Maple Ridge, Martha carried on. Her days in the diner filled with the steady rhythm of her routine. She felt a new sense of peace, a lightness that hadn't been there before. She'd spent so many years worrying, carrying the weight of secrets and regrets, but now With everything out in the open, she felt free. One evening, as she closed up the diner, Martha took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. She looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings, and felt a deep gratitude for the journey she and her son had shared. She knew that their relationship would never be perfect, that there would always be parts of herself she couldn't change. But she also knew that they'd come through something powerful together, that they'd built a foundation of trust and understanding that would carry them forward. As she locked the doors and stepped out into the cool night air, Martha looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of connection to the vastness above her. She thought about the paths they'd each walked, the choices they'd made, and the lessons they'd learned along the way. It was a story of love and resilience, of mistakes and forgiveness. A story that reminded her of the strength it took to keep going, even when the road was difficult. In the end, Martha and Daniel's journey was one of discovery, not just of each other, but of themselves. They'd each found something within that they hadn't known was missing, something that had been waiting to be uncovered. And as they moved forward, they carried with them the knowledge that love, in all its complexities, was the thread that bound them, the foundation upon which they could build a new future. For Martha, this was enough. She knew that wherever life took them, they would always carry a part of each other, woven into the fabric of their lives, a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the importance of facing the truths that lay within. And so, with a quiet heart and a peaceful mind, Martha walked home under the stars, carrying the love and memories that would sustain her, knowing that in the end, she and Daniel had found their way back to each other, stronger and more whole than ever before. As the months passed, the changes that had begun in Martha and Daniel during their time together only deepened. Each of them, in their own way, carried forward the lessons they'd learned, the forgiveness they'd offered each other, and the understanding that had blossomed in the heart of their relationship. For Martha, the experience of finally sharing her past with her son left her feeling renewed. She continued to open the diner every morning, pouring coffee for the same regulars, greeting travelers who came and went. But there was a quiet strength in her now, a confidence that she hadn't felt in years. She knew that, for all her regrets and mistakes, she'd done something right. She had given her son the best of herself, even when it meant carrying the weight of silence for so long. In moments of solitude, Martha would sometimes revisit her memories, but now they were softened by the healing that had taken place. She found herself less haunted by the choices she'd made and more grateful for the love she'd shared with Daniel. The burden of secrecy was gone, replaced by a peaceful acceptance of her life's journey. She was free in a way she hadn't been before, free to embrace each day without the shadow of the past. Back in Chicago, Daniel felt the ripple effects of his time in Maple Ridge in nearly every part of his life. He approached his work with a newfound sense of purpose, but he was no longer driven solely by ambition. He valued the connections he'd made and sought ways to give back, becoming a mentor to younger colleagues, sharing his experiences and encouraging them to consider the bigger picture beyond their careers. For the first time, Daniel felt rooted. He took time to reconnect with friends, to be present in ways he hadn't before. And every now and then, he would find himself reminiscing about Maple Ridge, about the diner and the quiet strength of his mother. Her resilience and her love had shaped him, and he carried that with him, feeling grounded in the knowledge that he was not defined by his success, but by the values she'd instilled in him. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, looking out over the city lights, Daniel thought about everything he'd been through, everything he'd learned. He realized that his relationship with his mother had given him a kind of personal freedom, a freedom from the past, from the expectations he'd placed on himself. And from the pressure to constantly prove himself, he was finally free to be who he was, flaws and all. As Martha and Daniel moved forward, they both found a deeper appreciation for the people in their lives, for the connections that brought them joy and comfort. They learned to value presence over perfection, understanding that love was often messy, complicated, and imperfect. But it was also resilient, capable of surviving the deepest wounds and coming out stronger. For Martha, there was peace in knowing she'd done her best, that she'd given her son a foundation of love that he could carry with him wherever he went. And for Daniel, there was a quiet pride in knowing he'd found his way back to her, that he'd faced the parts of himself he'd once tried to ignore. In the end, their story became a testament to the strength of the human heart, to the courage it takes to confront one's past and seek forgiveness, and to the beauty of a love that endures. No matter the distance, no matter the silence, Martha and Daniel's journey was one of healing, one that would continue to shape them for the rest of their lives. And though their lives would take them in different directions, they knew that wherever they went, they would always carry each other's love. A quiet reminder of the bond they'd rebuilt and the freedom they'd found together. As seasons shifted in Maple Ridge, so too did Martha's perspective on life. She'd long lived in quiet routine, surrounded by familiar faces and predictable rhythms, but something had changed. Each morning, as she prepared the diner and watched the first lights spill over the hills, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The world looked brighter, sharper, as though her heart had been unlocked, allowing her to see beauty even in the smallest details. Martha found herself pausing to enjoy moments that once passed her by. She'd watch the sunrise a little longer, savor the laughter of friends gathered at the diner, and take the time to listen deeply to others' stories. Each interaction felt more meaningful, and every shared smile became a reminder of the bonds she'd built, not just with her son, but with everyone around her. Her life was a mosaic of connections, small moments of kindness and understanding that created a beautiful tapestry of resilience and joy. One quiet morning, as she stood outside the diner watching the mist lift from the hills, she thought about Daniel, about how much he'd grown since their reunion. She imagined him in his own life, taking each step with the confidence and peace she'd always wished for him. And in that moment, she understood that love was like the mist that surrounded Maple Ridge every morning. It was everywhere, even when you couldn't see it, gently shaping everything it touched. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Daniel began to see his world in a new light. He still moved through the familiar streets and worked in the same bustling offices, but he carried himself differently. He no longer felt bound by the same pressures that had once weighed him down. Instead, he viewed his life with a sense of openness and gratitude, embracing the imperfections that made him who he was. Daniel started to seek out places in the city that reminded him of the diner, a small coffee shop on a quiet corner, a park bench under a shady tree, spaces where he could find a moment of peace amid the chaos. In these places, he would sit, breathe, and reflect on the lessons his mother had taught him. He understood that success was not a measure of his worth, that connection was what truly mattered, and that his past was something to cherish, not to run from. One evening, as he walked through the city, he came across a street musician playing a tune that reminded him of the diner, of the simple, honest life his mother had led. He stopped, closed his eyes, and let the music wash over him, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. In that moment, he realized that his life had been transformed, not in any grand or dramatic way, but in the quiet shifts of perspective that made everything feel more real, more meaningful. Both Martha and Daniel had learned to see life as a journey filled with symbols, reminders of the love they shared and the paths they'd taken to find themselves. For Martha, the diner was no longer just a place of work. It was a testament to her resilience, a symbol of the life she'd built for herself and her son. Each coffee cup she filled, each smile she shared, became an act of love, a reminder of the strength she'd found in her heart. For Daniel, the city was no longer just a place of ambition. It was a canvas on which he could paint his own story. Unfilled with moments of joy, connection, and peace, he carried a small photo of the diner with him, tucked in his wallet, a reminder of the journey he'd taken back to his roots and the love that had given him the courage to redefine his life. And as they each moved forward, mother and son, separated by miles but forever connected by the bond they'd rebuilt, they found comfort in the symbols that reminded them of each other. They knew that, no matter where life took them, they would always carry each other's love, a love that was patient, enduring, and quietly powerful. As Martha and Daniel continued their lives apart, they both found ways to keep the memories of their time together alive. These memories weren't just stories of the past. They were touchstones, reminders of the lessons they'd learned and the love they'd rekindled. For Martha, every little detail in the diner now held a special meaning. When she polished the counter, she would remember Daniel's hesitant smile when they first sat down together after years of distance. When she served her regulars, she'd think back to the stories she'd shared with her son, the pieces of herself she'd finally opened up. Each interaction at the diner felt like an extension of the connection she'd rebuilt with him. Every now and then, a traveler passing through would remind her of Daniel, a young professional grabbing a quick coffee, a tired traveler looking for a warm meal. In those moments, Martha's heart would swell with a mixture of pride and longing, knowing that Daniel was out there, carrying the strength and love they'd rediscovered. In Chicago, Daniel found his own ways to hold on to the memories of Maple Ridge. He had framed a small picture of the diner on his desk, a constant reminder of his mother and the quiet strength she embodied. On days when the city felt overwhelming or his work demanded more than he could give, he would look at that picture and remember the peace he'd felt in his hometown, the sense of grounding he'd found in reconnecting with his roots. One evening, after a long day, Daniel sat by his window, the city lights glittering below. He picked up his phone, scrolled to his mother's number, and hesitated. There was no urgent reason to call her, but he felt an impulse to reach out. To hear her voice, he dialed the number, and after a few rings, Martha picked up. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice soft. "Daniel, it's so good to hear from you." Her voice carried warmth, the kind that made him feel as if he were right back at the diner, sitting across from her. They spent the next few minutes chatting, catching up on the little details of their lives. Martha told him about a new regular at the diner, an elderly man who reminded her of someone they both knew from his childhood. Daniel laughed, sharing a story about an old friend he'd recently reconnected with, someone who'd helped him remember that life was about more than work and ambition. These phone calls became part of their routine, a quiet thread that kept them connected despite the miles between them. Sometimes they would talk about the past, reminiscing about memories they hadn't discussed in years. Other times, they would talk about their hopes for the future, sharing dreams and ideas that gave them both a sense of purpose and joy. In these conversations, they found comfort and strength. Their connection had grown beyond words. It was a feeling, a knowing that they would always be there for each other, even in silence. Martha felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible, knowing that her son not only understood her, but accepted her, flaws and all. And for Daniel, these calls were a reminder of the love that had shaped him, grounding him even as he navigated the busy streets of Chicago. As the seasons changed, they each carried their memories like treasures, small reminders of a time when they had reconnected. when they'd bridged the gap that had once seemed so wide. The memories weren't just moments of the past. They were living pieces of their relationship, symbols of the love they'd rebuilt and the strength they'd found within themselves and each other. And as they moved forward, Martha and Daniel knew that, no matter where life took them, their bond would remain unbroken, a bond woven from shared memories, quiet phone calls, and a love that was as enduring as the hills of Maple Ridge. As time passed, both Martha and Daniel found themselves embracing the new versions of themselves that their journey had brought forth. They had each experienced profound personal growth, and though they were miles apart, the lessons they'd learned from each other continued to influence their lives in ways both big and small. For Martha, the days at the diner became an opportunity to celebrate the simple joys of life. She approached each day with a renewed sense of gratitude, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She was no longer weighed down by regrets or unspoken words. Instead, she was free to live fully in the present, cherishing each smile, each shared story, each cup of coffee she poured. One afternoon, a young couple entered the diner, their laughter filling the room. They reminded Martha of herself years ago, full of dreams and unaware of the challenges that life would bring. As she watched them, she felt a surge of hope, not just for them, but for herself. She realized that, even at her age, there were still new experiences to be had, new ways to love, and new moments of joy waiting to be discovered. This sense of renewal extended to her relationships in the community. Martha found herself more open, more willing to connect with others. She began to attend local events, accepting invitations she would have once declined. She made new friends and strengthened old bonds, allowing herself to be a part of the lives of those around her in a way she hadn't before. Her heart, once guarded, was now open, and in that openness she found a sense of peace and belonging. For Daniel, the changes were equally transformative. His approach to work had shifted. He no longer saw it as his entire identity, but as a part of a larger, more meaningful life. He focused on finding balance, making time for relationships and experiences outside of his career. He reconnected with old friends, reached out to his family members, and even took up hobbies he hadn't touched in years. One evening, he decided to volunteer at a community organization, offering his expertise to young professionals looking to find their own paths. The work was rewarding in a way that was different from his corporate achievements, filling him with a sense of purpose and connection. In these moments, he found himself thinking of his mother and the quiet strength she'd shown him, her love and resilience inspiring him to be a better version of himself. As they both embraced these new beginnings, Martha and Daniel continued to keep in touch, their bond growing stronger with each conversation. They shared updates, celebrated each other's victories, and offered support during difficult times. Their relationship was no longer marked by the distance and silence of the past, but was filled with an ease and understanding that only love and forgiveness could bring. On one of their phone calls, Martha mentioned an idea she'd been considering, something that felt both exciting and a little daunting. "You know, Daniel, I've been thinking about taking a trip," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and nerves. "A trip?" he asked, curious. "Where to?" "Chicago," she replied, the word hanging in the air. "I thought it might be nice to see your world, to understand the life you've built there." Daniel's heart swelled with emotion, realizing how much this gesture meant. "Mom, I'd love that," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "There's so much I want to show you." And so, the seeds were planted for a new chapter in their journey. Martha's visit to Chicago would be a chance for them to continue learning from each other, to see how far they'd come and how much more there was to explore. It was a reminder that growth didn't stop, that love and connection were journeys that unfolded over time. As they each looked forward to this new adventure, Martha and Daniel knew that their paths, though separate, were forever intertwined. They had found a sense of wholeness, of fulfillment, that could only come from facing the past, forgiving each other, and embracing the future with open hearts. Martha hadn't traveled much in her life. For years, Maple Ridge had been her entire world, and she hadn't felt the need to venture far from its familiar hills and quiet streets. But now, as she boarded a plane to Chicago with a small suitcase and a heart full of anticipation, she felt an excitement that reminded her of being young again, ready to explore new places and make new memories with her son. When she landed, Daniel was waiting for her at the airport, his face lighting up as he caught sight of her. "Mom," he called, waving her over with a grin. Martha felt a warmth spread through her as she walked toward him, embracing him tightly. She could feel the love and pride radiating from him, and for a moment she marveled at how far they'd come to reach this point. Their first few days together were filled with laughter and discovery. Daniel was eager to show her the city he had come to call home, guiding her through bustling streets. Grand skyscrapers and hidden corners he knew well. He took her to his favorite coffee shop, a cozy spot with large windows overlooking the busy streets, where they spent hours talking and watching the world go by. Martha was mesmerized by the energy of the city, the constant movement and noise, so different from the quiet life she was used to. But more than anything, she was grateful to see her son in his element, to witness firsthand the life he'd built for himself. She saw the respect he commanded from his colleagues, the kindness in his interactions with others, and the deep sense of purpose that fueled his days. For the first time, she truly understood the world he'd chosen and felt proud of the man he'd become. One evening, Daniel surprised her with a visit to an art gallery. Martha wasn't sure what to expect, but as they wandered through the exhibits, she found herself moved by the beauty around her. Daniel explained the meanings behind some of the pieces, sharing his interpretations and listening to her thoughts in return. It was a new experience for them both, an exploration of ideas, a shared understanding that went beyond words. As they walked back to his apartment that night, Martha felt a profound connection with her son, a bond that had been strengthened not just by their shared history, but by their willingness to explore new parts of each other's lives. She realized that she'd not only found her son again, but she'd also found a friend, someone she could share ideas and dreams with, someone who saw her as she truly was. Throughout her visit, Daniel found himself seeing his life through new eyes. Having his mother there made him appreciate the little things, the moments he often took for granted. He began to understand that success wasn't just about ambition. It was about sharing his life with those he loved, about finding joy in the connections he had built. One evening, they cooked dinner together in Daniel's apartment, the sound of laughter filling the space as they shared stories from the past. Martha found herself telling stories she hadn't thought of in years, memories of her youth, her dreams, the life she'd once imagined for herself. And Daniel listened, truly listened, with an appreciation that filled her heart. They spent the rest of the evening talking about dreams and possibilities. And for the first time, Martha felt like her future was wide open. She had spent so many years focused on the past, on the choices she'd made and the sacrifices she'd endured. But now, sitting with her son in a city so full of life, she felt a renewed sense of possibility, a desire to embrace whatever came next. As her trip drew to a close, both Martha and Daniel felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. They had shared moments that would stay with them forever, memories that had deepened their bond and strengthened their love. On her last night, they sat together, watching the city lights twinkle against the dark sky, each silently reflecting on the journey they'd taken. "I'm so glad you came, Mom," Daniel said softly, his voice filled with emotion. It's been everything I needed." Martha smiled, reaching over to hold his hand. "Me too, Daniel. I've learned so much from you, more than you'll ever know." They sat together in comfortable silence, each understanding that this was just one chapter in a story that would continue to grow. Martha would return to Maple Ridge with a heart full of new experiences and a renewed love for the life she'd built. And Daniel would remain in Chicago, but with a deeper appreciation for his roots and the strength that came from his mother's love. As they said their goodbyes at the airport, neither felt the ache of separation they'd once known. Instead, they carried with them a sense of peace and connection that would last, no matter where life took them. Their journey together had taught them that love was not bound by place or time. It was a thread that wove through their lives, connecting them across miles and years, an unbreakable bond they would carry with them always. As Martha's plane touched down, she felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her. Maple Ridge, with its quiet hills and winding roads, had always been a sanctuary, a place of simplicity and routine. But this time, as she stepped out of the small airport and looked out over the landscape, something felt different. She'd left as one person and returned as another, her heart full of new memories and her mind alive with fresh perspectives. On the drive back, Martha allowed herself to reflect on her time with Daniel. Each moment they'd shared in Chicago felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, a glimpse into the man her son had become and the life he'd built for himself. She felt a deep sense of pride in his achievements, but more than that, she was grateful for the relationship they'd rebuilt. Their bond was stronger now, not just as mother and son, but as two individuals who respected and admired each other for who they truly were. Returning to her home, Martha felt a wave of nostalgia. The walls, filled with photos and mementos of the past, held stories she'd once kept hidden. But now, each memory felt lighter, like something she could embrace without regret. She moved through her small house, touching familiar items, a well-worn book, an old family photo, a quilt she'd made years ago, each one a symbol of the life she'd lived and the love she'd carried. The next morning, Martha returned to her routine at the diner, her movements slower and more deliberate as she opened up for the day. But there was a new energy in her, a quiet joy that radiated in her smile and her interactions with the regulars. People noticed the change, commenting on how happy she looked, how her laughter seemed a little brighter, and she'd simply smile, knowing they couldn't see the full story, but feeling no need to explain. Her joy was her own, a private treasure she carried within her. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the hills, Martha allowed herself to think about the future. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of her past, bound by secrets and the weight of unspoken words. But now, with Daniel's forgiveness and their renewed connection, she felt free in a way she hadn't in years. The future felt open, filled with possibilities she hadn't considered before. She thought about new things she might like to do, small dreams that had once seemed out of reach. Maybe she'd take up painting again, or perhaps she'd travel to places she'd only read about in books. She felt a new curiosity about the world, a desire to experience life with the openness she'd seen in Daniel. Her son had shown her that it was never too late to grow, to learn and to dream, no matter where one was in life. Back in Chicago, Daniel was experiencing his own transformation. His mother's visit had left an indelible mark on him, reshaping his understanding of family, connection, and love. He found himself thinking of her often, carrying her wisdom and strength into his everyday life. He approached his work with a renewed sense of purpose, focusing not just on success, but on meaning. He took time to connect with people, building relationships that went beyond the surface, embracing the values his mother had instilled in him. Every now and then, Daniel would call her, sometimes for no other reason than to hear her voice and share a moment of quiet connection. These calls became a source of comfort for them both, a reminder that their bond was something they could rely on no matter where life took them. As Martha settled back into her life in Maple Ridge, she carried with her the memories of her time in Chicago and the love that had grown between her and Daniel. Her world felt larger now, filled with both the beauty of the familiar and the excitement of the unknown. She realized that life was not a series of fixed paths, but a journey of constant growth and discovery, and she was ready to embrace it all, one day at a time. As the days turned into weeks, Martha found herself reflecting often on the journey she and Daniel had taken together. What had begun as a simple letter had evolved into something she couldn't have foreseen, a complete transformation of their relationship and, more importantly, of themselves. They had both come face to face with the shadows of their pasts. And instead of letting those shadows divide them, they had chosen to heal and reconnect. One evening, as Martha sat in her favorite booth at the diner, a wave of gratitude washed over her. The quiet hum of the place, the soft conversations of her regulars, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee all felt like parts of a symphony she had come to cherish deeply. Each element was a reminder of her journey, a testament to the life she had built and the people she had loved. Daniel, too, felt the echoes of their journey in his own life. He'd framed a photo of him and his mother from their time in Chicago and placed it on his desk, a constant reminder of the strength he carried from her. Whenever he faced challenges, he'd look at that photo, feeling the quiet encouragement she had always offered him, even when they'd been apart. Their journey had been one of discovery, a discovery that love, even when strained, had the power to heal, that forgiveness, even when difficult, could lead to freedom. They both understood that their lives were richer now, each of them carrying the other's love like a compass, guiding them forward. Martha thought about how life often surprised us, how the most meaningful connections could weather years of silence and still emerge stronger. She realized that love was not defined by perfection, but by endurance, by the willingness to forgive, to grow, and to keep coming back to each other. Daniel, on his end, embraced this same realization, understanding that his success was now measured not by the heights he reached alone, but by the depth of the connections he nurtured along the way. In the end, Martha and Daniel had both found peace, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because they had learned to see each other and themselves with new eyes. They had taken what was broken and made it whole, weaving their shared history into a future they could look forward to with open hearts. As Martha closed up the diner one last time for the evening, she stepped outside. Breathing in the cool night air, she looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of connection to something greater, a quiet knowledge that her journey was part of a much larger story, a story of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love. And as she stood there, a smile softened her face and her. Knowing that wherever life took them, she and Daniel would always be bound by the love they had rediscovered. In that moment, under the vast starlit sky, Martha felt a peace that was as gentle and steady as the hills around Maple Ridge, knowing that their journey, though not without its trials, had brought them home to each other in the deepest sense.